Welcome to Shoot First, Ask Questions Later, where we research the response of our past and review their relevance for today. This is your host, Moshe Kurtz. Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today we have the schus to be joined by Rabbi Yirmiyah Moldovan, and we are going to be discussing, admittedly, a topic that has mystified me and honestly scared me for quite a while. Every time I think about purchasing a new suit, I am gripped with immediate fear because there is always lurking the potential issue of Sha'atnez. And even though I shouldn't be saying this as a rabbi, Sha'atnez is still one of those areas of halacha that really scare me every time I go out to buy new dress clothing. And I am hoping our listeners, and myself included, will come out of this with a little bit more clarity. Now, the reason we have Rabbi Moldovan with us, let's just learn a little bit about him. He grew up in Sydney, Australia, as you'll soon be graced by his lovely accent. He studied in the Mir Yeshiva and in the Jerusalem Kollel, where he received smicha from Rav Yitzchak Berkovitz. He was the Rav of Congregation Havas Achim in Fairfield, Connecticut, and now lives in Waterbury, Connecticut with his family, just north of us here in Stamford, where we are recording today because he came in to offer some of his array of services. He's a Sha'atnez tester, a sofer, a shochet, a kriah, a tokeah. Oh my gosh, what don't you do? But we are going to be focusing on the Sha'atnez angle of one of your many areas of expertise. And maybe before we get to the particular tshuva today, which will be a tshuva of Rav Moshe and Igros Moshe, maybe just give our listeners and myself a little bit of a background to Sha'atnez before we get to the 20th century.
Yeah, sure, Rabbi Kurtz. So the Torah says that someone can't wear Sha'atnez, which means we can't wear wool and linen in the same garment. Now, to understand this, in the ancient times, almost all clothing was made of wool and linen. So this was a really big tircha and difficulty for people, because wool was the clothing which you wore in the cold climates, and linen was for the warm climates. You sewed with linen. Cotton was difficult to use because there was too many seeds in the cotton until the cotton gin was made, and there weren't synthetics, polyester, that they have now. So wool and linen were the main materials that were used historically.
So this is fascinating because, like, when I opened up this session with you just now, the way I said I approach Sha'atnez is I'm only gripped with fear on the occasion I go to get a new suit. But what you're saying is that this was ma'aseh b'chol yom. This was like any article of clothing you wanted to get potentially had these issues.
Correct. And in the times of the Chazal, the times of the Gemara, the times of the Mishnah, all those times it was a much bigger issue than it is now. It's still an issue now, but you really had very few materials to make clothing out of, so they were always dealing with Sha'atnez. And all the way through to Europe, you see there's tshuvas of Gaonim in Europe talking about how we're going to work out what's wool, what's linen, if they're selling us cannabis, if they're selling us linen. It was always an issue over time. Now, what happened now in the last 100 years, 200, 300 years, a couple of things happened. One is the cotton gin was made, which made cotton more available. Cotton is a very, very useful material. You can sew with it, you can make clothing with it. So it took out a lot of the linen. A lot of linen was replaced with cotton. The next thing that happened about 100 years ago was they made synthetics, where they made materials out of chemicals. And that's much cheaper and easier to make materials out of. And there's a lot of uses. You can sew and you can make clothing. So now, in addition to the wool and linen, which historically were the main materials, you have cotton and synthetics, which are just as common, if not more common, than linen definitely, and also wool.
So on the one hand, these can obviate concerns for Sha'atnez, but they raise new questions about, can you use it as for instance, the garment that you put your tzitzis on? So it raises new halachic questions that come into the fold with these new materials.
Correct. It raises
you plug one hole and then another one gets made.
Exactly. And halachically, it makes general issues less of a problem because you have more materials, but practically it makes it much harder to work out where the wool and the linen are, because it used to be there was wool, linen, there was cannabis, there was a couple of other random things. Now you have wool, linen, about 50,000 different types of synthetics, and you have cotton, and you have cannabis as well. You have a lot of other things. You have to poke through the whole hill to find what you're looking for.
Wow. So what exactly, just before we get into the halachic minutia and the concepts, I'm just curious, what does the process of checking for Sha'atnez look like? Because you just described there's so many different kinds of new materials and synthetics. What does one even need if they wanted to check for Sha'atnez? Do you need like a microscope? Do you need to actually know the chemical properties of the different kinds of possible fragments and garments that you're using? What's involved in the process?
Right, so people think you just take it to the Sha'atnez guy and he just sticks the suit under the microscope and says Sha'atnez, no Sha'atnez. But it's a much more complicated process than that. The first thing that you do is you look at the garment, you look at the label. That's the first thing. It sounds silly, but I've had many people bring me a suit that says in the label wool and linen in it. Right? So you look at the label, and the label will give you an idea of what it is. You can't rely on the label, but it can give you an idea of what's going on. After you look at the label, you look at the material. You can use it. Some people use a loop to see how the different threads move through the material to get an idea what's happening with the threads. Not everyone uses a loop. Next thing you do is you take out some threads from the garment and you unravel the thread to get the fibers of the thread. And different fibers, when they're packed into a thread, they act differently. So for example, wool is very springy. And as much as you try to unravel, to straighten out the fibers, they will not straighten out. They'll infinitely stay springy. Other materials like polyester, even if it starts off springy, when you try to smooth it out, it smooths out. Then linen is like a material that it's like there's little bits of they call them bundles, packed together. Everything's packed together because the pectin, which is the glue that holds the woody linen to itself, it holds all the fibers together in little bundles. So the first thing you do is you unravel the thread and look at the fibers. If you can't tell from the fibers with your eye, the next thing you do is you can burn them. And different materials, it doesn't mean you burn the suit.
Right.
You just take a thread and you burn it, and different materials give off different scents and they burn differently. So for example, when you burn polyester, it's made of petrol, it's made of gas. So it burns like a nice geschmack of fire. But if you burn wool, it's hair. It barely burns. It just burns for a split second and it stops.
Wow.
And then the smell of polyester is like gas. The smell of wool is disgusting. It's like burning hair. It's like burning skin. It's a disgusting smell. And the next thing you can do if you don't get anything from the smell, from the burning, is you can chew it. Again, chewing a thread, not the garment. And different materials have different properties when you chew them. And if you're still stuck, the next thing you do is microscope, which means, again, it doesn't mean putting the garment under the microscope. You take a thread, break it into fibers, make a slide, and put it under the microscope. And the microscope is really the most clear way to find out what the material is. But the problem is it's got the most tokeah involved. You can't take from the garment 20 different slides. It's going to take a long time. So you do rely on the microscope when you're stuck or to confirm Sha'atnez, but you only do that as a last step.
Wow, so that's a fascinating overview, and it sounds like something that, to a certain degree, one obviously has to know the halachos, but there's also a huge element of knowing the metzias and really just having tvias ayin and knowing kind of the facts and this almost the science behind it. It's not just something that you could seemingly read a sif of Shulchan Aruch and then jump into testing for Sha'atnez. It's something that one has to actually be able to understand and see, whether with an instrument, without an instrument. And I never realized, how much really just goes into it. Now I understand why we pay that premium. It makes sense. There's a lot of labor involved in the process. But I think the question that many people have, including myself, is, okay, I understand now what's going on when I bring my clothing to be checked for Sha'atnez, but how do I determine which clothing requires Sha'atnez? What's the probability? I mean, I guess anything in theory, the company can choose to put some linen and wool in there, but how do I determine which clothing needs to be brought to a Sha'atnez tester? And I think that's what brings us to the enigmatic tshuva of Rav Moshe.
Correct. So Rav Moshe has this tshuva in Yeridea, Chelik Aleph, Siman Ayin Beis. It's a very, very famous tshuva. And the Sha'atnez part of the tshuva gets hidden at the end of the tshuva. It's nivla in the rest of the tshuva.
Those are by the way, the best tshuvos in Igros Moshe is where he just slips in a parenthetical, or the shoel, the inquirer, clearly had more than one question, and then Moshe's like, oh, by the way, you had a second question, let me quickly answer that one. I don't know if we'll talk about it today, but his shita on not requiring microscopes as we discussed before we recorded, is not in a tshuva about microscopes. I believe it's a medical halacha-oriented tshuva. And yet there's literally actually parentheses, which you don't usually see in Igros Moshe, where he talks about that you don't need microscopes to measure tefillin. And I've seen in modern halachas farm, they extrapolate that to not requiring it to check for bugs, for tolayim as well on food. But anyway, right, this is a parenthetical right at the end of a tshuva, which talks about a catering company which is going to cater a chasana where there are averas taking place, which I think just means that the men and women are together, dancing together, and the question is whether they are facilitating an avera. And then right at the end, almost seemingly a non sequitur, he talks about Sha'atnez. But it's not really a non sequitur, because it's also talking about, can I give clothing to someone who will not check for Sha'atnez, right?
Correct. Yeah, so Rabbi Moshe, he was asked about the catering, and then after that they asked about can someone sell clothing to someone who's not going to check for Sha'atnez. And Rabbi Moshe in this tshuva, he gives 3 hagdoras. So he says, if something is muhsek, that it's going to have Sha'atnez, which means it's roiv Sha'atnez, you're not allowed to sell it to someone who's not going to check, because you're practically giving him an issa. And he should check. He's not going to check. So you're giving him issa. Rav Moshe says, even if it's miut hamotzui, which it means, miut hamotzui means it's not roiv, and the Torah doesn't require you to check it, but the Rabbanon said you have to check it. Even if it's miut hamotzui, you're telling him, I'm giving you an issa de Rabbanon, and he's not going to check. You're not allowed to give it to him. And then the third Hagdara, Rav Moshe says, very cryptically, he says, and even if it's less than mira motzui, his lashon, he says it's a rak chashash ba'alma, kagoin shehu mir she'ena motzui. It's a mir which is not motzui, shemidina yesh lemezel basaruba, because technically, halachically, you go by the roiv, v'rak mishum she'efshel levarui machmarina levarer, just because it's possible to look into it and clarify it, we're machmir to clarify it. He says in that third case, you're allowed to sell it to the Jew, even if he's not going to check. So he brings down 3 different criteria. There's something which is muhsek, it's roiv, something which is mira motzui, and something which is even less than mira motzui, where machmirinon to be mavaret.
So let me understand this. So this sounds, of course, very similar to the sugya about what kind of vegetables do you need to check for bugs. So we know that vegetables that are muhsek b'tolayim, there's over 50% chance that they will have an infestation. We don't bother dealing with them generally. And it's something which is a miyat she'eno matzoi, which I understand that every rabbi and his grandmother has an opinion on what the precise percentage is, but let's just say 10% for argument's sake. If it's below 10%, you don't need to check. But like you said, there's this miyat hamatzoi, which is a significant minority chance, and that rabbinically requires us to investigate the matter. But what's fascinating is what you're pointing out here, I see, is that Rav Moshe is saying is even if it's, let's just say, under 10% chance, let's just say it's an absolute minority, nonetheless, we are stringent to check for Sha'atnez because it's Asher Livrei, because we're able to investigate. And I guess if I understand this correctly, where then does the line get drawn?
Exactly. That's the big issue. As in, if you're going to say Mira Matsui, there's different shittas what Mira Matsui is. The 3 main shittas are, the Rivosh in a tshuva says, it's korov to the roiv. Somewhere in the 40s, very close to a roiv. The next shitta, which is a major shitta, is the Mishkanas Yaakov. That's the generally accepted shitta. You could say it's 10%, as you alluded to. The next shitta, which is a very interesting shitta, is Rav Vosner. Rav Vosner in Shevet HaLevi, he says the Mira Matzah is not based on percentages. It's not based on percentages. Mira Matzah means it's a miut, it's a minority, which won't surprise you. So when you're checking, let's say checking vegetables, you're checking a date. I mean, that's a fruit, but let's say checking a date. So in Eretz Yisrael, you check a date, you see a bug. It's not crazy, it happens.
Right.
But let's say you're checking your cucumber and you see a bug. You're like, wow, that blows my mind. I was not expecting that.
But here's the funny thing, because kind of as observant Jews, we are trained to expect to see bugs everywhere. I saw this video, I forgot where, on YouTube or somewhere a while back, some non-Jewish YouTuber, they had this video like, guys, if you look closely enough, you can see there's actually bugs on the strawberries. And this was like made in like 2022, and I'm like, shkoyach, the Yidden knew about this since Matan Torah. So, whose expectations are we talking about? How informed does the person need to be? I think that's an interesting, broader question when we want to be kovea rov and majorities and umdinas. Who are we looking to assess what the normative opinion is? So that's a bit of a broader question to ask here. But this is still odd because what Moshe is saying is even, let's go with the 10%. Let's go l'chumra over here. Even if it's below 10%, we still need to investigate their Sha'atnez. So what do I not need to check then, according to Rav Moshe?
Right. So you see, Rav Moshe, he's invoking this idea of efshel v'rurei. And there could be, even if something is less than Moshe, there could be multiple reasons why there would be a reason to check. So Rav Moshe says efshel v'rurei. That's a sugya, which is in Chulin, that the Gemara says that even though roiv mitzuin eitz or shchita mumchin, that most people who are shochtim, not most people from the street, but most people who are shochtim are gonna shecht well. Still, when you find that someone shechted something, you got to ask them, did you shecht well? You got to check into it to make sure that they did a good shchita. The Gemara is over there. You, in theory, should rely on the roiv, that roiv people who do shchita, not roiv people off the street, but roiv people who do shchita. And a guy did shchita for you, roiv people who do shchita, do a good shchita, you still have to ask questions. So the Gemara brings that down, and that's a sugi in halacha. And at the end of the day, it's one of these sugyas which is like a shas sugya. It's very hard to pin down exactly the geder, how far, like you mentioned, where do you draw the line? Are we checking our suits and are we checking our socks and our underwear as well? The fear of Moshe. Like, where do you draw the line?
Right, and like that microscope topic, like we were discussing off the microphone before, Rav Moshe, it's brought to his attention that the Brisker Rav, was saying that you need a microscope to measure your tefillin, and Rav Moshe says that's not how halacha operates. We're not expected to be mitzamtzim to that degree by using this new technology. So clearly Rav Moshe elsewhere understands that there's some limitation. But another interesting thing I think we should think about is that a suffix that's efshel levar, that when we have a doubt, we have an unknown, but we're able to get the answer, that's not called an unknown, it's just called us being too lazy to find out the answer, but we should go find out the answer. But the question, I think, is how much tircha and how much does one have to expend in order to be mevar or something? So I don't want to put your business and livelihood in danger, chas v'shalom. But the question is, how much money and how much should someone have to go out of their way to find a Sha'atnez tester and to pay them for that service? I think that's an interesting question. It's not just efshel levar, I could just look at the security cameras, it takes 2 seconds. What's the threshold there?
Right, and I think that's what Rav Moshe is alluding to. Rav Moshe is saying that we are machmir to spend $15 and take our suit to the Sha'atnez guy to check for Sha'atnez. But I think Rav Moshe would be maskim that no one is expected to take their socks and their underwear to the Sha'atnez guy. Why? It's also going to cost a few dollars in a trip because there's a level where it's too much tircha based on the chashash. Right. But again, what the geder is, it's not clear from this Rav Moshe exactly where you draw the line. It's not clear. And like I said, it's one of these shas sugyas where it's hard to nail down exactly where you draw the line of how much tircha you say efshel v'rurei on.
Right. So let's say I wanted to actually get to the bottom of this matter. So what svarim are at my disposal? I go into the base medrash. What's in my arsenal of svarim that I can use to actually figure out halacha l'maisa? What's the gather? What are the parameters of the expectation for me of when and what I need to check for Sha'atnez?
Yeah, good question. So it's interesting. In the world of Sha'atnez, firstly, there's not many books written on Sha'atnez. There's a handful of books that the Sha'atnez testers have, and they're good books, but there's not any major go-to books on the world on Sha'atnez. And the issues that we're dealing with when we're talking about what needs to be checked, most of the issues are like shas sugyas. Like, for example, this sugya, efshel v'rurei. That's a shas sugya, and it's a very difficult sugya to nail down. A couple of other sugyas that come in here. You have a roiv. You're somech on the roiv. There's a Gemara in Kiddushin which says that when you're talking about the way people think, the way people do things, you don't go with a roiv. The roiv of the Gemara is a roiv beteva. Animals are born in a certain way. Animals get sick. People get sick in a certain way. But when you're talking about what I do and what I think and what you do and what you think, how can you build a roiv? Each person thinks differently. you can't build a roiv. That's a sugya of savloinus. Do people be Makadosh first and then send a gift, or do they send a gift and then send a kiddushin?
Right, we have these ideas of like Batla Daito Itzel Kol Adam, an idea that I might feel a certain way, but sometimes we look at what the majority of people think. And it's an interesting question that we need to ask, is that when do we take the individual opinion into account versus when do we just say your individual opinion doesn't matter? We look at an umdana, we kind of just do general guesswork. I don't know, I guess we don't poll people. I guess Chazal just had a general sense of what the Olam thought about something. Maybe someone gave a clap in the Beis Medrash, they did a yay or nay vote.
Right. So at the end of that sugya, there is a sugya in Shulchan Aruch, but at the end of the day, it's not clear when you say that the roiv, you use a roiv based on an umdana, based on how people think, and when you don't do it. Another sugya, there's a Gemara B'Choros which says a roiv which is toli b'masa, a roiv which is toli on something that someone does, it's not a roiv. And again, it's a big machlokes rishonim. Is it a ma'aseh gedola, ma'aseh katana? How do we paskin on this sugya? So again, when an animal's born, an animal gets sick, there's no ma'aseh there. That's teva. Teva, you can build a roiv, because teva is olam kimin hago hoilech. You can understand. But when I'm talking about a guy making a suit, so you have one factory, one Chinese guy, one other Chinese guy, who says you can build a roiv? Each person is doing his own thing. Everyone's doing their own ma'aseh. What's my ma'aseh got to do with his ma'aseh? How can you build a roiv based on a ma'aseh? Wow. So again, this is another shas sugya which is difficult to nail down. Another one, which is another shas sugya, which one time I asked Rav Asher Weiss, I asked him what needs to be checked for Sha'atnez. And he said that there's a sugya called kavua. Mm-hmm. And called kavua kemerza merza, which the Gemara in Kesuvah says that if you walk into a store, a meat store, and there's kosher and treif, even though it's roiv kosher, since you walked into the store, we treat it as 50-50, and we treat it as treif. So over here, if you walk into the suit store, if they have Sha'atnez there, even though not everything is Sha'atnez, maybe we say kavua kemerza merza. So he said, you have the sugya kavua, and he himself said, even though no one really knows what kavua is. No one really knows. Again, it's one of these shas sugyas. So he said, no one really knows, so, it's another reason to be machmir. Because it could be it's kavua. Again, all of these sugyas, efshel ruay, roiv she'ena beteva, roiv tole b'maisa, kavua k'mersa, these are shas huge sugyas, which it's hard to nail them down.
Yeah, we can we're sitting in the Beis Medrash now. We can pull the shmaisis and the kuchas sfeikus off the shelves, and these are things that people spend years in yeshiva learning about. This is like the meat and potatoes of what you're doing when you're sitting learning Gemara. These are like the sugyas that really comprise shas.
Right, and these are sugyas which it's hard to get a clear hachra on. Wow. So that's a problem here. Another couple of problems. One of the good Sha'atnez from Sha'atnez Halacha L'Maisa is written by Rabbi Elchanan Cohen. He's not a Sha'atnez tester. He's an Avrech in Bnei Brak. He said, I want to learn Sha'atnez. He learned the sugyas well. He asked around. I asked him what needs to be checked. He doesn't have this in his book. And he said he went to Rabbi Yoshev and asked Rabbi Yoshev, why is it that everyone's checking stuff which is not mira motzi? He said Rabbi Yoshev told him two answers. He said one is efshel v'urei, like the tzomes hagidim, which is in the chicken. We don't check for most of the treifas in the chicken. We just make sure we did a good shchita. But nowadays they check in the tzomes hagidim, which is the sinews in the leg, to make sure they're kosher. It's definitely not mira motzi, probably not mira motzi. But they check it because efshel v'urei, and it's not major tircha, at least on the assembly lines. So he says efshel v'urei, and the second answer he gave, which is a politic answer, he said because if no one checks, then all the stores are going to be full of Sha'atnez.
What?
So I think
what does that mean?
I think the hezber is it's sort of like a takonas hashuk type of thing. Huh. He didn't tell me this. This is just what he said from Eliashiv. I think it's a takonas hashuk type of thing, as in you have to be checking stuff, because if you don't check, there's going to be everything's going to be Sha'atnez. No one's going to be on top of it. No one's going to know. Everyone's going to be wearing Sha'atnez.
Wow. So this sounds a little bit similar to Rav Moshe in a certain way, because Rav Moshe also said that Shemidina yesh lemezel basaruba. Even Rav Moshe said that me'ikar adin, according to strict letter of the law, many of these things that we're checking don't require actual inspections, but we are machmir to do it. And it sounds like it's kind of a chumrah that developed, and it's not clear to me whether this was a conscious decision or maybe just a lot of people, like myself included, or from what you're describing, it sounds like almost everybody doesn't really know what requires checking, what doesn't, and we're erring on the side of caution. Or it's actually very, so we're supposed to get it checked.
Right, and then there could be another reason that the chumrah of Sha'atnez itself, The chumrah of the isser of Sha'atnez itself is a serious isser. For example, the Noda B'Yehuda brings down that if someone wears Sha'atnez, his tefillahs aren't answered for 40 days.
Well,
from the time he wears Sha'atnez. So it's a serious isser.
So I just shouldn't bother davening for the next 40 days?
I don't know.
I guess there's the kriah to daven still. It just won't be answered, but it shouldn't.
Right, I guess. The next thing is every second someone's wearing Sha'atnez. It's a different aveira. It's an extra aveira. I asked Rav Asher Weiss in the same conversation what needs to be checked. He told me, he said, you know what? If someone eats heta mechira, he said, oive. He said, if someone eats treif, chazer, he said, oive, he did an aveira. But he said, if someone wears Sha'atnez, he's going to be wearing that same suit for the next 6 months to a year, all day long, doing one aveira after aveira. He said, kedai lahachmir.
Wow.
Kedai lahachmir. That's Rav Asher Weiss. Rav Asher Weiss is not mina machmir in general.
No.
But that's what he told me. He told me, Baal Peh, he said, kedai lahachmir because of that. Because of the...
Yeah, you don't want to, lahavdil, to borrow a term that's kind of used in America, to live in sin. You're going to be wearing that, and it'd be kind of ironic. You're going to wear your big day Shabbos. You're going to wear that suit on Shabbos thinking that you're doing an extra mitzvah and kavod HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Meanwhile, you're dressing yourself in sin and averos. It reminds me, from the positive standpoint, I think that Minchas Chinuch and others describe the notion of when I put a mezuzah on my wall. So it's not just a one-and-done mitzvah, but it's a continuous mitzvah for every moment that's up there. There's a discussion, that sugya, of the nature of it. So we have certain things which are just continuous mitzvahs, or unfortunately for Sha'atnez, continuous averos. And maybe, on the one hand, the chances of you getting it wrong are very small, but the result, if you do get it wrong, is very high. And I guess the issue is, like, Ein Lanu Isek Ben Istaros, we can only speculate so much, because you could say, well, if I went based on halacha and I got the wrong result, why would Hashem hold that against me? Or maybe it's just naturalistic. You stick your hand in a fire by accident, you still stuck your hand in a fire. It's you brought up the example of eating treif. Arguably, even if you eat treif by accident, there's still timtum halev. It still has some metaphysical effect on you. The same way if chas v'shalom you eat poison. Even if it was by accident, you didn't mean to do it, but it has a naturalistic negative effect. So that you definitely made a good pitch. Now I'm like, now I want to get my shirt, my pants, my sneakers. I want everything checked for Sha'atnez now. So I guess that kind of leads me to, we don't do halach l'maisa on the podcast. So we're going to, for legal purposes, we're going to say this is not halach l'maisa. But just give our listeners, and give myself some hadracha, give me a general approach. What kind of things do we think need Sha'atnez checking? What kind of things don't we need? May Iker Hadin recommended. Just what would your bekitzer, your roadmap be for us?
Yeah, sure, Rabbi Kutz. So I'm going to focus on men's clothing. I'm only going to talk about suits, men's clothing, basic things.
But you could bring Rabbi Moldovan into your community if you wanted to give a more expansive presentation on others. You see, that's the premium content.
Right, but I will say the expansive presentation is not normally so advantageous. One time when I learned in Australia, I actually learned Sha'atnez, and the person who came to teach me, he taught me, he's a big boki in Sha'atnez, Rabbi Shochet, and he gave a shiur on Sha'atnez, and it was overwhelming for people. Huh. The men can bring their suits, but once you start with women's clothing and everything, it's overwhelming. Again, I'm not saying things don't need to be checked, but it has to be done with a lot of chokhmah, how it's taken care of. Someone who's involved in Sha'atnez, he told me that there was a time when they wanted to give specific guidelines on specific clothing. It could have been suits, could have been sweaters. They wanted to say, these need to be checked, these don't need to be checked, these do, these don't. And they felt that would be very advantageous. The reason he brought it up, because I said to him, I think we should give more specific guidelines of what needs to be checked. And I think that'll motivate people to check.
Right.
He said many years ago they considered that. They went to Rav Chaim Kreisworth. And they asked him, should we give specific guidelines on this? He said, don't give specific guidelines. No one's going to send anything to check. Whoa. He said, if you say check your suits, people will check your suits. If you say check the suits that are wool and this and that and not the polyester and this, it's too much for people. People will just say, I'm not checking anything. That's what he said.
I thought people go the opposite direction. People say, I'm going to check everything because I can't fight. I guess it depends on your inclination.
Right, exactly. So that's what I found in my experience checking Sha'atnez. There's people who check and there's people who don't check.
This sounds sorry to interject, this sounds very similar to issues that come up in Hilchos Nida. You know, like sometimes... I don't want to start getting into this, a whole separate podcast about yoetz at halacha and, you know, women comfort and consulting. But basically, if a woman feels like she doesn't have an easy posek or someone to consult on questions, there are some women who will go l'chumra, be more machmir than they need to be on hilchos nida, on taharas mishpacha. And there are some who will go in the opposite direction and say, well, I guess I don't know, so we're not going to investigate the matter. So this is something that comes up in many areas of halacha, kashrus as well. So you'll have people that go l'chumra and some will go l'kula. But what exactly should we be doing then?
Right. So again, I'm not here to give halach l'maisa. Me'ani lahachnis roishi bein harim. There's different people who say different things, and really should ask your own rov to get a psak on what needs to be done. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that I do want to be ma'orer is Rav Moshe said we're machmir to check our suits, even though it's not miramotzui, because it's efshel levarai. Pashtus, what Rav Moshe means is it's a chumrah. Although I have heard people say, I don't think it's right, they've said that he means it's a chumrah midina. Onu machmirin, because it's efshel levarai, and efshel levarai is a halachic concept, and so you have to do it. You can sell to the person who's not going to check, but you yourself, you have to check. I don't think that's what Rav Moshe means, but yesh lodon. Mm-hmm. But let's say I think he means that you don't have to check, mikradin, but l'chorah it's the right thing to do. And that would apply pashtus to all suits. All suits, you have to get them checked, even if they're not miramotzui. However, this is very important to know, expensive suits have a very, very, very high chance of Sha'atnez. More than 50% chance of Sha'atnez. Expensive suits. Why is that? It's not stam they're trying to be machshel all the yidden who are going to buy the expensive suits. There's a reason. Because when you have an expensive suit, one of the main things that makes the suit geschmack, that makes the suit good, is when it sits on you, it sits tight to your body. It's nice and spitz. You see the guy with the expensive suit, he walks around, it's like sort of stuck to his body. The lapel is tight and spitzy and pointy. It sits on his body. When I have my cheap suits, when I sort of lean forward, my lapel sort of unfurls, you know, like it unrolls.
I thought that was just a 5 towns flatbush thing. I guess maybe because I'm more heavy set, so I don't want something so tight to me. But okay, apparently that's the more spitzy kind of suit.
Right. So that's the chokhmah of making a good suit is that it stays on your body tight. How do you do that? The way you do that is you stiffen the lapel. The way you stiffen the lapel is that you put something stiff in the collar. So the collar stiffener is important to hold the lapel in place. In expensive suits, they use linen because linen is the best collar stiffener around. Linen is wood, so it's stiff, but at the same time it's malleable. So when you put linen in the suit, it holds the lapel in place. As you get expensive suits, almost always have linen in the collar. It's very rare that they don't. They almost always have linen in the collar, and the higher you go, the more expensive you go, it asymptotically goes towards 100% that they have linen in the collar.
So if I got you right, we should essentially be machmir only to get inexpensive suits, which I totally support. It reminds me also of the machlokis in the mid-20th century, Rav Menashe Klein, Rav Moshe, and others, about the issue of putting plastic covers on one's hat. And there's this whole issue of hotzah, it's a covering, is it called your clothing? And I joked when I shared that in a shir here recently. I said, and that's why I'm machmir, Rabbi, say not to wear a hat. I don't want to be machnis myself into a suffix. But if I'm understanding correctly, so your main ha'ara that you want to share is you're in dangerous territory when you get expensive suits. But we could say presumably those who are willing to spend all that money on that really expensive suit, they could spend another $15, $30, whatever it is, to get the Sha'atnez checked as well, right?
Exactly, that's correct. And if there is Sha'atnez in it, it can be removed, it can be fixed. It does cost money and time to do that, but it can be done. So that would be my main ha'ara, that expensive suits need to be checked me'ikradin. They're more than roiv to have Sha'atnez.
Wow.
And also, in addition to expensive suits, Hugo Boss suits. Hugo Boss is not cheap, but it's not expensive, necessarily. Hugo Boss has a chokhmah where they dafka put linen in their suits, even the cheaper ones. So Hugo Boss is also more than 50%. It has Sha'atnez, and they should be checked. So again, I'm not coming to say other suits don't be checked. I want to be clear about that. But my ha'ara is that if someone will say Rav Moshe means it's just a chumrah, I don't want to be machmir. If someone will say, and I have heard people say, I've heard Rabbanim say, you don't have to check Sha'atnez. You don't have to check Sha'atnez nowadays. Wow. And I hear where they're coming from, because they're saying, most of the suits everyone's buying, they don't have Sha'atnez. And so they're saying, they're not machmir for this Rav Moshe. They're saying it's ki'ilu like the socks and the underwear, for whatever reason. But it's too low a level. So they say they don't need to check. And then what happens? Their Talmidim, they don't check. But the problem is, they might be right to an extent, but then their Talmid goes and buys a Gucci suit, he goes and buys a Boss suit, and it for sure has Sha'atnez. And you'll tell him it needs to be checked. He said, no, this posuk said it doesn't need to be checked. So you have to have a bit of a nuance over there.
And I think the lesson here is, if we could expend so much on the gashmias and on the materialism, at least we could spend a little bit more money on ensuring our spiritual welfare, especially given what you said about the nature that's an Isser Doraisa. It's a continuous Isser Doraisa. It's certainly something that we want to make sure to get done right. And Rabbi Moldovan, that's why we bring you in, and I appreciate your services here in Stanford, and also for sharing your chachma with the broader listenership of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Thank you for listening to Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate us, subscribe, and leave a review. If you would like to submit a letter to the editor, sponsor an episode, or just have a general inquiry, please email me at mitchellmkurtz@gmail.com. This is Moshe Kurtz, and I look forward to learning with you next time on Shoot First, Ask Questions Later.